whether or not it really works for recovery. What's my opinion on this product? Well, waxy maize at one time was the starting material that vitargo was extracted from. So if you think of a glass of milk or milk powder, dried milk powder, and then you think of whey protein isolate, they're two very different things. The whey protein isolate is extracted from the milk powder, and most people would agree that whole milk powder is different chemically and biologically how it works in your body than whey protein isolate. Whey protein isolate is a fraction taken from whole milk powder. Waxy maize starch has been a starch that's been around since the 50s. It's been used to make wallpaper paste, regular paste, textiles, and other things for industries, not for commercial use. It's also used in food processing to make things thicker to help them gel. At one time, after vitargo, which was first extracted and taken out of potato starch for the first two studies where it was shown to get out of the stomach, into the small intestine, and almost over twice as fast as maltodextrin sugars, or to replace muscle glycogen 1.7 times faster. That was vitargo extracted from potato starch, which I introduced back to EAS back in 97, 98, before it was called vitargo. And then because potato starch extracted vitargo was very difficult to mix, it was like mixing cement powder, cement paste, waxy maize starch was chosen as a starter starch from which to extract or pull out and create a whole new novel starch or an engineered starch that doesn't occur in nature. And so waxy maize starch, even though it was a starting material, it's very different because it's an extracted fraction, unique, novel, engineered starch from waxy maize. And in that study, or in those studies that were done, indeed the effects of vitargo, even though it was from a different source, are still the same because vitargo is patented around a unique molecular composition. So then if you look at the studies on waxy maize starch itself, just plain off-the-shelf waxy maize starch, there are 4. The first 2 studies back in 96 show that if you give athletes waxy maize starch before exercise, the insulin spike and the glucose spike is about 2 to 3 times lower than maltodextrin. 2 to 3 times lower, not higher. And that study was done at Ball State University and published in 1996. In that other study, they actually gave people either waxy maize starch or dextrose or maltodextrin, or actually waxy maize starch, maltodextrin, or waxy maize starch and dextrose. And they measured their change or improvement, including maltodextrin, in muscle glycogen 24 hours later after exhaustive exercise. The highest glycogen recovery was with dextrose. Maltodextrin and waxy maize starch were about the same, close, but there was no difference between the 3. So their waxy maize starch is no better at replacing muscle glycogen than maltodextrin or dextrose. And then a third study, or rather a third study, was done in 2002, and they showed the same laboratory that invented the glycemic index. That was up at the University of Toronto in Canada. They gave people maltodextrin, sugar or sucrose, or waxy maize starch, and the glycemic index rise, the blood sugar rise, was 2 to 3 times lower with waxy maize starch. So it's a very slow digesting, and in that paper they called it a slow digesting, low glycemic carbohydrate. In the most recent study, which was actually made public about a year ago, from Purdue University, they gave people maltodextrin and sugars, mostly maltodextrin, and a few grams of sugars, totaling 50 grams of carbs, or waxy maize starch, 50 grams of carbs, or 50 grams of carbs from white bread. And they measured the blood sugar response, or the glycemic index, for 4 hours, and the glycemic index response for maltodextrin was twice that, 2 times higher than that of waxy maize. And it was about the same as white bread. However, the insulin spike from maltodextrin and a little bit of sugars was 3 times higher than that of waxy maize starch. White bread, the insulin spike was 2 times higher than that of waxy maize starch. So again, it confirmed that waxy maize starch is a slow digesting, low glycemic, low insulinemic carbohydrate, completely opposite of what is often being said. The reason why waxy maize starch is described as a fast glycogen insulin spiking carb is because at one time waxy maize starch was extracted for the source for vitargo. But it isn't that way anymore. We use barley starch now, and waxy maize starch is very different than vitargo extracted from waxy maize starch. Again, whey protein isolate versus whole milk. Totally different chemical composition, totally different biological response. there's nothing wrong with wax-made starch. It just isn't the type of, it doesn't perform in the way that people have been led to believe. Its best, perhaps, could be an ideal thing for wax-made starch to be used for a long-term endurance ride or run or activity where you have a slow digesting, low glycemic, low insulinemic carbohydrate. In that context, it may be a superior long-term endurance fuel, but in the studies that have been done most recently at a major university in the U.S., doing a 120-minute bike ride at about 60% maximal pace, there was no performance improvement at the end when doing a 15-minute sprint. So we don't know yet where the evidence points to wax-made starch